I'm Peter, and this is the Tarot Table with Bonnie and Peter, where we lay the cards on the table and talk about life, tarot, and everything in between. So shuffle your deck, pull up a chair, and join us at the Tarot Table. Hi, I'm Peter.
And I'm Bonnie.
And this is the Tarot Table with Bonnie and Peter. And today's episode, we're going to focus on a couple of things. We're going to take you through what the tarot actually is. So we're going to imagine that you're standing in the middle of your favorite esoteric shop, your favorite tarot-friendly store, and you're faced with all of these boxes that say this tarot deck and that tarot deck, or this oracle deck and this angel deck. And we're going to try and help you determine, or we're going to try and explain, well, what is the tarot? And then we're going to kind of go into helping you or providing you with some suggestions around choosing your first deck. So, Bonnie, I'm going to imagine here I am, let's say I'm standing in our favorite tarot-friendly store, and I'm staring at that wall that you and I both know extremely well, with all these different size and colored boxes. And, I want to pick a tarot deck. So what is that? What is a tarot deck?
What is a tarot deck? That's a great question, Peter. And I love this topic because it does bring up a lot of confusion. There are so many card decks out there. So not all card decks, excuse me, are tarot decks. So if you're familiar with like oracle cards or angel cards or even like spirit animal cards, there are so many different types of decks that you can get. And those generally fall under the category of oracle card decks. And those don't necessarily have a system unless the author is creating it in a way that is their own system. So oracle cards can really be anything that the deck creator wants them to be. Now, when we look at tarot, tarot is a very specific system that is used to create the deck. So the decks can vary, like different pictures, but it is a system that it follows. So tarot and oracle are very different in that respect. And what tarot is, it's a system of 78 cards broken out into the major arcana, which are 22 cards. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in depth. And then it's also broken out into the minor arcana, which are 56 cards, which is also broken out into a few more categories. So that's the main difference between, you're staring at this wall, there's a million different card decks in front of you and you don't know what to choose. So oracle can really be a system of anything, whatever that creator wants to portray in a deck of cards. They can be affirmations. They could be about crystals, like so many. They're beautiful. I fell in love with oracle cards, and that's really how I started this journey. But then once I got to know the tarot, I really dove deep and was like, oh, this is a system of cards. And once you get to know the tarot, then you're able to read other tarot decks with ease because they generally have the same meanings, and they follow a certain system. So what would you say, Peter, if you were working in a shop and someone's like, hey, I want to buy a deck of cards, what would I buy?
Yeah. And I mean, if we're talking about, I want to buy a tarot deck, and I would remind them that if they're familiar with a regular deck of playing cards, that they actually already know about 75% of the tarot system, because you had mentioned that the tarot is divided up into two kind of major groups, the major arcana and the minor arcana. And the minor arcana is literally a deck of playing cards. It's four suits, ace to 10, face cards. The only big difference is if, in a regular deck of playing cards where you have jack, queen, king, you actually take the jack, split it in half, and you give it two different names. So like that whole section of a tarot deck is almost the same as a playing card deck. That's what I would tell them. I'd say, you've got this massive mystery. They're going, oh my goodness, what's a tarot deck? And I'd say, well, if you've played Go Fish or Crazy Eights, or you played blackjack or poker or hearts, or bridge or cribbage, you're actually already familiar with the structure of a good chunk of a tarot deck. And then, the major arcana, which we can talk about, is, but the images that are in there, they're things that we know. We see them all the time. It's, the cards like the High Priestess and the Magician and the Hermit, and then, some of the scarier cards like Death, or the Tower, but they're big, they're cards of big ideas. But there are only 22 of them. So you got 22 major arcana cards, 56 minor arcana cards, put them together, a deck of 78 cards, which is, exactly what you said. So it's a system. It's consistent across, oh, what would there be, Bonnie? Thousands of different tarot decks,
Probably.
probably, right? Which doesn't help when you're thinking, oh my goodness, I want to get a tarot deck, and you're faced with, well, which deck do I pick? And you have thousands upon thousands of options, and somewhere, the images don't look anything like another image. So we want to, rest assured, we want to assure you that if it's called a tarot deck, it is based on a consistent system from deck to deck. And that means 56 cards in one section, 22 cards in the other section. Now, I guess we should probably divide, or, maybe explain a little bit more about, what those sections are. But do you think maybe we'll start with the major, or we'll start with the minor arcana, because I always think that's the easiest. So,
Yeah, it's funny because most times people start
I
with the
know,
major,
major.
but I love how you broke that down into like it's like playing cards, right? So and even people use playing cards for readings, right? So I think that's amazing that you do that. And then once you get to know like the playing cards, you can apply those same principles to the tarot. So if we look at the four suits, those are like the four suits in tarot, right?
Right.
So the club suit is associated with the suit of wands, right?
Yeah.
Which is also, you can break that down a little bit further into an element, and then that's the element of fire.
Right.
And then when you take the swords are the spades. I'm doing this in my head, Peter. So the spades, the suit of spades is the swords. And then you break that down, and then that's the element of air. And then we have the hearts, which is
Mhm.
easy. It's the hearts.
Yeah.
It's cups, the suit of cups. And then you're breaking that down into the suit of
The element of water.
element of
Yeah.
water. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then diamonds, you think about this abundance in diamonds, and that equates to the suit of pentacles,
Mhm.
which then elemental, that is the element of earth.
Yeah.
So when you look at the four suits like that, you can break those down into how the tarot is actually laid out. And then same, the ace to the 10 is the same that's in the cards. And then each of those have their own meaning. So if you kind of get to know generally what does an ace mean, you can apply that to all the different suits and then take into account the element of that suit and then apply that to the reading. The court cards.
Yeah.
I think the court cards are
They're always a
probably
lot of fun, right?
yeah, they're probably the hardest thing for people to get to know. And there's so many different ways that you can read a court card. But again, they're four different people in a suit. So they're contained within that suit, within the minor arcana, and then you apply those same principles to the people, I guess, that are in the cards. And you can look at them as a personality. You can look at them as somebody who's in your life, or an energy that, you may need to acquire or work with to sort of help you get through what it is that you're questioning. So that's kind of a confusing way to explain the minor.
Well,
What do you
no,
have to add,
not at
Peter?
all. Because when you talk about that, that analogy between playing cards, which not everyone knows, but most people are really familiar with, and the tarot, they have some real similarities. And I think, um, even if someone who was overwhelmed even wanted to step back, just knowing that, oh, a deck of playing cards has four suits, Tarot has four suits. A deck of playing cards has ace to 10. Tarot has ace to 10. And a deck of playing cards has face cards, and we literally call them face cards. In the tarot also has face cards. We just changed the name to court cards. And that's simply because, when they were constructed, they were given the names of court people. But that's no different than we could call playing cards court cards as well. We have a jack or a knave and a queen and a king, which are based on characters that existed inside royal courts, which is exactly where these characters come from. And then you made a great point of having these suits attached to elements, which are really important from an interpretation perspective, especially from a simple perspective, where we talk about things like the hearts in a regular playing card, which are attached to the cups in a tarot deck, which are attached to water. Well, then when you think about what a heart symbolizes or what water symbolizes elementally, then you start getting into the category. Well, hearts are usually about our relationships and about romance or about our emotions and our intuition and those things that we actually hold inside of our heart. So that word is a great word, not only to help you understand one card of the suit of cups, like the heart-based suit, but to understand all of them. And each suit kind of works that way. So it can be, and I don't think neither Bonnie or I want to dismiss the fact that it can be a lot. Learning the tarot, can be intense, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming because most people are already coming at it with um, with a base of knowledge. Even just seeing a regular deck of playing cards gives you something to connect to the tarot, at least to the minor arcana of the tarot. Anything to add around that, the aspect of the minor arcana? Because I agree with you. You said, people want to start with the major arcana, but I'm like, well, if I'm completely new to the tarot, why wouldn't I start with something that might be more approachable, like the minor arcana, because it is kind of analogous to a deck of playing cards. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And I love that because if we approach the tarot from this idea that, wow, there's 78 cards and I have to learn 78 different meanings, when you break it down into these smaller categories, like there's four suits. So what does that suit generally represent?
Yeah.
It just becomes a little bit more familiar. And then you can, even if you're pulling a card and it's a wand, and you're like, okay, this is a wand card. What are wands generally about? That starts to help you develop that relationship with the tarot. So I do think that that's an easier way to sort of get to know the cards and then be familiar with the structure.
Yeah. And you
Tarot.
even alluded to the numbers as well. So if we go at something like, an ace or a two or a three or so forth and so on, we think it's complicated because, like you said, well, there's 78 cards. But when we think of the two of something, we already know a lot about the number two, right? We know it's a number of pairs and relationships and balance. And those are
Harmony.
right, harmony. Those are all things that actually come into play with the two of each of the four suits of the tarot. So in some ways, there's common sense built into the system of the tarot that do make it much, much easier to learn. Now, what's sometimes harder to learn or harder for people to get their heads around are the cards of the major arcana because there's no immediate kind of connection to that. So I'm gonna, if I can, I'm just gonna start off by saying, but that's not true because I think the major arcana in some ways is constructed. So I always think, the minor arcana often talks about situations in day-to-day life and the stuff that we do, the stuff we love and the stuff we care for and the jobs we have and the thoughts and the ideas that we go through in our day-to-day life. Whereas the major arcana are all those big ideas. They're the philosophies of life. They're the ways in which, either we or society kind of conduct themselves on a big scale. And as we've talked about before, when we work with those cards in a reading, they're the ones that say, hey, you need to pay attention. Major card comes up, and they're things like the emperor and the empress, or the high priestess and the magician. So, those ideas that represent the manifestation of something in the magician, or, the global or universal, external feminine or masculine, as we kind of see in the empress or the emperor. And these things can look completely different in different cultures and different experiences, but the ideas are universal. The idea of a feminine energy is quite cross-cultural, or the concept of the death card, which, kind of scares everyone. But then the death card is one of the cards in the major arcana. But that idea of something having to end so that something else can begin, the idea that something needs to be emptied so that something can be filled, that exists everywhere. And, those are the kinds of cards that are part of the major arcana. And like, I always think the major arcana are those 22 cards where you really can get lost because people will go extremely deep and philosophical, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can connect big ideas of the major arcana to things that exist, in our everyday life. But I don't know. I think sometimes that's where people get lost. Like, oh, they're big, they're scary cards. They mean this, they mean this, they mean this, they mean this. Well, they can be, but they don't have to be. I don't know. Do you have what do you think about the major arcana as a concept? Or if somebody was learning the tarot, what would you tell them about those 22 cards?
Well, I love what you say, that you've said this in the past, when the major arcana shows up, it's like, pay attention. So it's uh, that reminder that this is going to have an effect, probably like a lifelong effect, or there's going to be a major decision or something that's really pertinent in your life right now. And what I love about the majors is that it's a story. So you go from the Fool all the way to the World, and it tells an entire story. It's an entire cycle. And this is, it shows that the cycles that we're constantly going through in our lives. So I do think it's like a really beautiful rendition of all those things that we go through, and it's laid out in this form, in pictures that we can look at and really resonate with. So the major arcana can seem a little bit scary or hard to learn, but if you really look at it through the storytelling lens, you start to understand it more. And then you can even see in your own life where these cards have come into play for you. You could take an event that happened in your life and apply all of those cards to that event, and then see how that came up for you. So whereas, the minors are what they are, and then the majors tell this other story, but they weave in so beautifully together. And even with the majors, you can apply some of the like the aces, right? Like any cards that have a one or represent a one, they sort of have that same um underlying meaning to them. So you can still get a lot of knowledge about learning the majors in what you know about learning the minors as well. And for some people who are learning tarot, sometimes they just start with the majors, right? And then they get to know those 22 cards and only read with those 22
Yeah.
cards. So that's another way of approaching the tarot as well. It's just, yeah. And the other thing about the tarot and the majors and the minors is they get so specific, which is what I really love about the system. You can pull a card and it's really, you're looking at something and you're like, that is exactly what's happening in my life right now. So the tarot has this way of really going deep and really showing you what is could be going on in your life at this very moment, which I think might be a little bit different than what I've experienced with some oracle cards, which could be a little bit more broad, in a sense. But this, because it tells the story, you can play with the story. Like if a card shows up, I often look and say, what's the card that came before this? And what's the card that's coming after? So you can sort of start to see patterns, or, past, present, future, just by pulling one card. So I love the system. I think it's brilliant. And it's such a great way for discovery and helping yourself. So, yeah, I guess our message here is, don't be afraid that there's 78 cards, because you can notice patterns in the way the structure was created.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, no, thank you for that. And it is a system. That's, I think what we're both trying to say as well is that, there are ways to kind of to access the meaning and information in cards through different systems, as you talk about the story of the major arcana and the thread, of the story that kind of weaves its way from, as you mentioned, from the Fool all the way to the World. And there are even different iterations of that story, that you can become kind of familiar with. There's the myth of the hero that we often see, in stories. There's the actual fool's journey. How does the fool kind of make their way through that? And you can also apply those, to the events and situations that are happening in your own life. And the same with the minor arcana. Like, so the one thing I want to get back to, the first thing I had said, is that there is a system. So, I think our initial purpose for this episode was to try and help you if you're looking to kind of start the tarot. Well, what is the tarot? And the tarot really is systems based, and you can use the system of the suits or of the numbers or even of the rank of court cards or of the numbers in the major arcana, or of what they mean to help you access the meaning of the cards. It doesn't have to be daunting and overwhelming. But I guess what could be daunting and overwhelming, is still standing there in that wonderful shop, or even if you're looking online, and you're just faced with a multitude of choices. Oh, if I want to pick my first deck, what do I do? I, where do I go? And I know we both have, not different approaches. We both had different journeys as to, well, what was the first deck that we've picked, and how we go about that. So tell me, Bonnie, I want to pick my first deck now. You've convinced me. The tarot is a system. What do I do? What do I do? What's
Dude.
help?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. And we may have different ways of looking at
Yeah.
this, but I think for starters, it would be really asking the person, what is it that you want to do with the tarot? Like, why are you interested in this practice? And what is it about this that's sort of alluring to you? And then I think from that point, you can get an idea of, well, if you're looking at this maybe for self-discovery, let's say. I can give my example of where I came from the tarot. I was initially really afraid of the tarot. And when I started thinking about, well, maybe this is a possibility, I don't know. I talked to a few different people. People were like, you should start with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And right away I said, no, I don't want to start with that deck because there were images in that deck that really scared me. So I didn't want to start with that deck. I wanted to start with something that would ease me into the tarot. So I'm saying this because if you're generally sort of fearful of some of the cards that might be there, or you're not really sure, then maybe start with something a little bit more gentle, which is exactly what I did. And then the next deck I bought was the Rider-Waite-Smith. So I became familiar with those cards. I realized that, they weren't depicting things that were actually going to happen. And then I was like, okay, I'm ready now. I'm ready to explore the Rider-Waite-Smith. Do you We can talk about this a little bit
Yeah.
later, but there's sort of three different avenues of tarot that you can go down. So if you're wanting to explore the tarot and there's all these decks that you're in front of, it could be that it might be easier to pick a path and go down that path. Well, I'll let you explain this, Peter, because you can probably explain it a little bit better than me. But starting with something that's probably a little bit more well-known
Right.
or a little bit um
Yeah, a little bit more accessible, right?
a little bit more
Because,
accessible. Thank
well,
you.
and you had mentioned the idea of starting with the Rider-Waite-Smith and saying no, and I think that's probably a pretty common response, and because the images of the Rider-Waite-Smith are old, like they, Pamela Coleman Smith, who's the artist who drew them, a reason why we call it the Rider-Waite-Smith, created the images in 1909, right? And she was just in post-Victorian England, so the images represent the social values and the world as it was at the turn of the last century. So that's not going to represent the world in which we live. And you're right, some of the images can be scary. I always think the challenge is, though, is I would suspect that somewhere in the neighborhood of, 80% of decks, though, are inspired by the system of the Rider-Waite-Smith. So, you said like you picked up a deck and then went and picked up the Rider-Waite-Smith. And that's always what I would suggest to people. I always think if you're right, there are three different ways to go. And I think what you were alluding to is they're kind of like three different tarot families. If the tarot was a family tree, then they're kind of like three branches. And the biggest branch is the Rider-Waite-Smith. It's not the earliest branch, but it's the biggest branch. And most decks are based on this system. There are two others, and we can talk about them briefly. There's the Marseille deck, which has its own kind of system, and the Marseille deck has been around for quite some time. I think the earliest decks, around the 1630s or so. But the big difference between them is that the major or the cards of the minor arcana, which is the one system we had talked about, are symbolic. They're not illustrated. Whereas the Rider-Waite-Smith was the first deck that illustrated all of the minor cards. So the cards ace to 10 and the four suits, they actually have pictures on them. They've got drawings on them about kind of day-to-day life. The Marseille doesn't have that. What if you've got the 7 of cups, you have a drawing of 7 cups. If you have the 2 of coins or the 2 of pentacles, you have a drawing of 2 pentacles. And that can be challenging for somebody who's starting out wanting to use the tarot for interpretation. So that's kind of branch number one, that's a branch. We've got the Rider-Waite-Smith as another branch, and then we have the Toth deck, the Crowley deck, or the Crowley-Harris deck as kind of branch number three, and it's kind of an in-between deck. So, Crowley and the people who created the Rider-Waite-Smith sort of came from the same background. But Crowley went back to the Marseille and did more of a stylized version of, the minor arcana cards. And so the same thing, the 5 of cups in the top deck is a drawing. Now it's a stylized drawing. It's kind of an Art Nouveau drawing of 5 cups, but it doesn't show the same kind of situation that the Rider-Waite-Smith does. So, you do have to decide what path you're going to go on. And I always think, well, you have decks that are inspired by these three branches. You have Tarot de Marseille inspired decks, you have Toth inspired decks, and then you have Rider-Waite-Smith inspired decks. And that last category, that Rider-Waite-Smith inspired deck, is by far the largest category of tarot decks. So, if you find that the images of the Rider-Waite-Smith confronting or challenging or scary, then doing exactly like you did, Bonnie, getting a deck that where the images may be might resonate a little bit more or might be less daunting or less scary is not a bad way to go. But the second thing you did was get a Rider-Waite-Smith. And for me, that's what I would suggest, because then you can almost see, well, where's the artist coming from as well? And then, the other thing we had talked about, and maybe we talked about it in our pre-podcast chat, is that if you use the Rider-Waite-Smith, the vast majority of books or online courses use the images of the Rider-Waite-Smith because, well, one, because they're not bound by copyright. They're part of the public domain, so books can use them without without having to pay for them, because they exist in that regard. But also because they're prominent. Like, you will find it, in all likelihood, it is the most commonly used deck that's there. But, as you mentioned, that some of the images are pretty harsh. But, I know when I work with students and clients, I'll be upfront about that. And I'll say, I just want to let you know that some of the images can be confronting. But then I often have, like, I won't call it a softer deck, but I have a much more modern deck that, I'll work with, and I'll pull the images to say, see, here's the death card. And yeah, it looks pretty scary in the Rider-Waite-Smith, but this is what it might look like in one of the other decks, which, can kind of help. But I definitely honor the space that you and other people are coming from, where some of those images, are pretty challenging. it was the Rider-Waite Smith I started with, but I would have started in the mid 1980s, where although there were other decks, there weren't anywhere near as many as we have now, right? I don't know how many there were, but I mean, I can think of 5 or 6 that would have been available at the time, and that would be it. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
And thank you for explaining it like that, Peter.
No.
I knew you would do a much better job at explaining that than me. And again, to give some people some advice about picking their first deck, if you know what you want to use it for and you're wanting to go down the Rider-Waite Smith path, then maybe, if you're in a store, I would absolutely talk to somebody about what it is that you're looking for, because even some Rider-Waite Smith inspired decks, they may call things something different.
Correct.
The suits could be called something different. So if you're really wanting to understand the structure of the tarot, then I would start something that's very close. Like the cards are called the same thing and the suits are called the same thing, and in a style that resonates with you. So I've had some people ask me about certain decks and they haven't owned a tarot deck. And I said, that is a great deck, but the cards are called something different. So if you're trying to use a reference book that didn't come with that particular deck, you're gonna have a hard time trying to correlate that card to something else because it's called something different. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind. So definitely go online, look at videos, talk to people. And if you're interested in buying your first deck and you sort of want to start with something that's standard, then people can absolutely offer advice on what's out there, because there are thousands
Yeah.
of
Agreed.
decks.
Agreed. And just for those of you again who are unfamiliar, we'll tell you what the standard, so what the standard names are, so that you can go, well equipped to ask your questions. So ace to 10, which is, ace is a 1, so it's ace 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The standard court cards in a tarot deck are page, knight, queen, and king. And then the standard suits are the wands, the swords, the cups, and the pentacles. And as Bonnie mentioned, the names can change in many different ways. But I would agree with you 100%. The easiest way to learn would be to not stray too far from where from the names that most of the resources that you're going to find are going to use. So that's kind of the one thing that I would sort of add to that. But thank you for providing your insights there too. So we think what we sorry, go no, go ahead, go no no go
No,
go
I
go
was
ahead.
just going to say it's, and then it's not to say that you can't use one of those other decks.
Yeah,
If you're drawn
totally.
to a tarot
Yeah,
deck and you want to buy a deck because you resonate with that deck and it's calling you in some way, then pick that up and learn it. But that will, how do I say it? Like, you'll work with it in a way that is meant for you.
for you.
But if you're wanting to understand the structure of the tarot and get into this practice a little bit, more intensely, then it doesn't even have to be more intensely, but just to really understand that format, then that's why we're sort of guiding you to something that's a little bit more standard, I guess. We're not saying don't get one of those other decks, but if you want to understand the standard structure, then
Yeah.
it would make sense to go down that path. Sorry,
Yes.
Peter.
No, no. No, I was going to actually remind people too that in a previous episode, we actually talked about our favorite decks, and each of us talked about a deck that would be very much based on the Rider-Waite Smith, although, it's not. I had talked about Isabella Rotman's deck, you had talked about Chris Ann's deck, and both of those decks are, are almost in every card, not in every card, but in almost every card, are quite true to form with the Rider-Waite Smith. So, but as you said, if a deck resonates with you, then use it. And often decks come with their own great resource. One of the nice things about being, the author of a deck is that you can use those images in the companion book that you create, and they can be a great place for you to start if that's, what your purpose is like, no, I've seen this deck. I want to learn how to use this deck for whatever purpose that you decide, then it's a great place to go. Anything else, any other advice, we should be giving this person who now, is hopefully standing in this shop with all these boxes sitting in front of them and are at least a little bit better equipped because they know what the tarot is. They have a general idea of where they should go, in their first deck. Any last pieces of advice for them, Bonnie, when they're picking their deck?
Well, I think we mentioned this in our first episode about like picking up the deck, like hold on to the
Yeah.
box, right? If you're sort of debating between a few different decks, and then later on down the road, you might just be like, oh, I'm just going to buy all three. But pick it up and see how it feels in your hand. Does it feel good for you? Like what energy sort of do you get from that card or sorry from that deck that you're holding? So I would do that. I would also, again, if you're not in a store and you're at home and you're contemplating wanting to buy a deck, maybe looking at some videos and getting familiar with the cards and seeing how those pictures resonate with you. And then you'll start to develop a style, and then you may be drawn to certain deck creators because a lot of them have many different decks. They don't just create one. And that will start your journey. So it doesn't have to be this is the only deck you're ever going to buy. It might be, but if you get into this practice, you might decide that you really like it, and then you'll probably start wanting to collect a few more decks. So make sure you have that connection in a way to the deck that you're contemplating buying.
Yeah.
What about you,
And
Peter?
no, when you said, and you just might find yourself, collecting decks. I'm going to say, in all likelihood, if you find yourself drawn to the tarot, one of the most, I think, sometimes one of the scariest parts, but sometimes one of the most enjoyable parts are actually collecting different decks and finding, how well or how differently you resonate with the images of a variety of decks. So don't dismiss that either. And you might also find too that you start working with a deck because of where you happen to be in your tarot journey, and that over a period of time, that what connected you to that deck shifts, and allow yourself give yourself permission as well to sort of shift where you are, with the deck that you use as you kind of move forward into your tarot journey. But I always think as we move forward into our tarot journey, though, because we've kind of covered everything that we're going to cover. We're each going to do our live card pull and our discussion for today. Do you want to start that off, or do you want me to start it? Because I will use the Rider-Waite-Smith, so you get a sense based on the images that get pulled. And I don't know, maybe I will pull a confronting image today. So we'll see.
I don't know. Do you want to start or do you want me to pull a card, Peter?
um,
what do you
you know what? I'll start. I've got my deck in hand, so let me give it a shuffle here. I'll get started. Are you okay
Okay.
with that? Does that
Oh
work for
yeah,
you?
absolutely. I'll shuffle my deck while you're shuffling yours.
Uh, Here we go. I mean, not confronting, but I always think it's the 10 of wands. So again, if we're kind of looking at, well, what does a tarot card look like? This is the Rider-Waite-Smith, and it's identified by number 10, and you can kind of see the 10 up here in a Roman numeral up at the top, and it's wands, which is identified by the wands it's themselves inside the card. Now, in a regular playing deck, if you had a 10 of something, all it would be is you'd have 10 of that object. 10 of clubs would have 10 clubs, 10 of diamonds has 10 diamonds. In the Rider-Waite-Smith, what Pamela Coleman Smith, the artist who did these cards, has done is she's drawn something on each of the cards. And what it does often for those of us who work with the tarot from an interpretive perspective is it helps us with the interpretation. So I've got the 10 of wands here, right? And the 10 of wands is a really interesting card because it's a card, as you can tell by the image, it's a card of overload. And it's often one, where, and I'll say, it personifies the idea of someone who is exceptionally busy. But this card, I say it's a card of overload, but sometimes it's a card of overload where the result of the work is often caused by other people, that it isn't necessarily our work that is causing us to be overloaded. I always think what this card kind of summarizes is that idea that if you want something done, give it to a busy person. Right? And this is a card of wands. And you had mentioned, Bonnie, early on that wands are associated with fire. So I think fire, that's where our drive and our determination sits so nicely in fire. And this is really represented in the suit of wands in the tarot. So it's a helpful energy when we want to get things done. The problem here is this is the 10 of wands. This is an over the top end of the, journey energy. It takes that idea just a little bit too far. Like if you look at this person, they don't even look, they can't even see where they're going. Their face is so buried into their work that they're just kind of driving forward. They can't see the end of the journey, which is, kind of portrayed in this card. So, this card is about, it's about driving forward. It's about taking on all the tasks, whether they're yours, whether they're other people's, without any kind of regard as to whether or not it's going to be effective or efficient or productive. So I always think, when I see this card, it's an invitation to stop. It's to, kind of raise your head up, look and see where you're going, and maybe put the load down and rest. And if you choose to pick it back up again, be a little bit more discerning. Allow perhaps good judgment and reason to decide whether or not you're going to pick up one, two, or whether or not you're going to pick up, all the wands, kind of represented by that task. So, when I see this card, this is one of those cards where people look at it and go, oh my goodness, like this does not look like a good card. And I'm like, well, sometimes it's really just a reminder that we have too much on our plate and that it's okay for us to kind of put those things down and think about what it is that we're picking up. And then if we decide to pick up all 10 wands, at least we're giving it some thought. We're picking them up, from the perspective of good judgment. Anything that you have to add about, about this particular card?
Yeah, I love that interpretation and I agree with everything. Yeah, so generally when that card comes up for me or if I'm working with clients, I ask them, I'm like, what are you saying yes to? And what are you saying no to? And, it could even just be a really busy social calendar. There's those people that get invited to everything and they say yes to it all, right? And then they're running around. So it's this idea of having, like, what are you carrying on your shoulders, right? Like, how much stuff do you have? And is that enjoyable for you? If it's not, then what is it that you can delegate to other people? Or what is it that you can say no to, right? Because again, it could be this because it's in that element of fire, like it's probably things that you're really passionate about, but sometimes too much of a good thing is too
Right.
much.
Yeah.
So I think it's really checking in and seeing like what can I put down? Exactly what you said. Like what can I put down and what's really important for me to carry going forward? Like what are some of those things that I can let go of so that, it's more about quality over quantity.
Yeah.
So
Wow, great. I love
yeah.
the practical language that that you kind of add to that interpretation. So yeah, yeah. Thank you, thank you. All right, your turn.
Okay. So I'm going to use my the Light Seers Tarot by
Yeah.
Chrysanne. So this was the first deck that I started working with. And let's see what shows up. Okay. Oh, isn't that funny? So I pulled the Hermit.
Yeah.
So in her version of the Hermit, it's this lady, she's sitting, I guess, on the edge of a mountain, and there's light all around her, and there's stairs going up the mountain, but she's alone, sort of with her thoughts. So I do love the Hermit because I think I resonate with this card a lot. It's this idea of it's okay to be alone for introspection, and oftentimes we're looking for um answers or clarity on the outside, but we know that if we go within, we can see that light, like we can shine our own light to get clarity and to discover different parts of ourselves. This could even be a healing journey, and it's about taking time to be alone. And this isn't about isolation. It's not about like this idea that, oh, I'm going to be alone and it's this bad thing. Sometimes the hermit has this negative connotation to it. But I love the fact that it's a reminder that just to take some time for yourself, for your own self-care, for introspection, getting to know yourself. This could be maybe starting a meditation practice, anything that brings you closer to yourself so that you can be that shining light for you. And oftentimes, when you do that work for yourself, that helps other people around you. So when you really take the time for your own self-care, uh, other people will benefit from that just because you're benefiting from that. And I think we forget about that a lot of times. We're always busy looking after everybody else. And until we actually look after ourselves, then that helps us to be that guiding light for other people. And sometimes that's what the hermit is too, being that shining light for other people, but doing that in a way that really helps you to expand and grow and get to know you, even if that might seem scary to you. Sometimes people don't want to be by themselves with their thoughts, and that can be frightening. So in a gentle way, how can you do that for yourself?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, yeah, thank you for that, because um, it is a card, and you use the word about, I think you had said it can kind of feel, lonely, and it's not actually a card of loneliness. It's a card of solitude. And I think, there's a difference, because, loneliness is sometimes the result of when we want to be around other people and we're not.
Yeah.
Whereas the hermit really is an invitation to be with ourselves. It's it's not withdrawing, it's recognizing that learning that we can do can be done in solitude. And I love that you brought out the idea of the light. Was, the one thing I also think too is that the light is also critical to the person who's there in the image. And I would invite those of you, because we've been talking about the Rider-Waite-Smith. I'd invite those of you to go and take a look at the hermit image from the Rider-Waite-Smith, because it's very
Iconic.
different. It's very different. Well, I say it's iconic because a version of the hermit actually sits inside the album cover of Led Zeppelin 4 with the song with Stairway to Heaven. Jimmy Page actually put that picture on the insole, as just as an aside. But the idea that that light lights the path of the person who is there, that they've made their way up to the mountain and that they're sitting there, but that internal journey is also going to help them get off the mountain and kind of move forward. And that's, that light can be very helpful to that too, you know. And for those, who were, just kind of getting into that tarot journey, we actually, interestingly enough, drew a card from the minor arcana, which was the 10 of Wands, and drew a card from the major arcana, which is the Hermit. So, without, unbeknownst to us, we randomly drew one card from each of those two sections. So just
Yes, good
fine,
observation,
right?
Peter. You're so good at pointing that out. I get so excited about looking at the card. I'm like, oh,
Well,
this is the card I
I
got.
mean,
And then I'm like, yeah, it's
me
major.
too. I was actually, and when you did that, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to go see if I can pull the Hermit card, from the Rider-Waite-Smith. Because again, the decks are all here, but I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. People can find that, if they want to go and take a look at what the Hermit looks like, from
And even Google
the
that Led
Rider-Waite.
Zeppelin album. Because when
Yep.
you told me that a long
Yep.
time ago, I thought, oh my gosh, I
Yep.
never noticed that. So I was frantically Googling it and like showing my husband, look, the tarot.
Yeah, right in the center. And if we ever get into an episode where we're talking about the major arcana, I always think it's really interesting, because we talk about, to kind of come full circle to talk about one of the sections, you know, of um, of the tarot. Some of the images of the major arcana are actually quite iconic, and they're used in popular culture. And there are also ways that we can, that we can connect with the major arcana. And the Hermit is a great example, because it's, I mean, I call it Led Zeppelin 4. I think it was, the album that came out with Stairway to Heaven and Black Dog and rock and roll. It doesn't have a name. It's got all four symbols, but anyways, at the center there's the Hermit holding their lantern. So,
Well, and if you think about Stairway to Heaven in that
right,
connection with the Hermit card,
right.
it's right. Okay, we could go deep into this.
Right. Well, yeah. As a lot of people can, right, with the major arcana. Like you can stay surface, or as you said.
Yeah, because if you think about this idea of living heaven on earth, where does that start? That starts with you, right? With this idea that you're already whole and complete and perfect just as you are. You don't need to achieve anything or go anywhere to experience what you really want to experience. And being with yourself, that could be, through meditation or doing something that you really enjoy and bringing yourself back to that core of who you are, which is like bliss and unconditional love and expansion and connection. Like that's the message.
Agreed. Agreed.
I
Um,
love that.
so thank you again, for sharing our, our cards, our card draw, our card pull, and and hopefully helping you find a deck, or defining what the tarot is. Um, Bonnie, if there were other things that people wanted to find or get support from you, where might they do that? And, what might they find there?
Sure. If you want to find a little bit more about me, you can go to my website, which is breathewithbonnie.com. That'll be in the show notes. So in there, you can see sort of the things that I'm passionate about, some of the services that I offer. I love to teach yoga nidra, which is a meditation practice, and do card readings and workshops and retreats. So my information is there if you'd like to connect with me. I also have a blog, so I put lots of fun things on there, and recipes. I love to cook and bake. So there's lots of recipes on my
Nice.
blog. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So how about you, Peter? What are you working on, and how can people get in touch with you?
Well, people can always find me via my website or via, Facebook or Instagram, always peterwhitetarot.com or, at Peter White Tarot on the two social medias. I will, or social media, I will probably focus, since we talked about the major arcana as part of it. I've actually got a course coming up starting June 11th, which is a deep dive into the major arcana. So, we'll look at each card, we'll look at the meaning, we'll look at the symbolism, we'll look at the narrative, some of the things that we talked about are the stories that kind of weave their way through. We'll look at the correspondences, so some systems like esoteric and astrological symbols that are connected to the major arcana, and then we'll figure out how we can use the major arcana in a kind of an approachable and easy to understand way. Courses are, they're live lessons, but they're recorded. So if you can't make them, you can always watch the recording. Access is perpetual. That means if you sign up for the course, you always have access. You can review it 100 times if you want. There's an active comment section. There's additional learning supports. Um, yeah, it starts June 11th. The course portal opens June 10th, and there's actually early bird pricing available until May 31st. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. If you want to take a bit of a dive into the major arcana, it's a great way to do it. And with that, I want to thank you for pulling up a chair and joining us today at the tarot table. And we look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Thanks again, everyone. Bye bye now.
Thanks for listening.